Well, good evening, good morning. I don't know when you're watching this, but I'm glad you're here because we are High Street Youth Live. We're coming at you again. Thank you for joining us. We value your time a lot. So today we're going to jump right into it. We're starting a new series today, and it is called The Bible from 30,000 Feet. So what does that mean? We want to give you guys an overview of as many books of the Bible as we can this year. So what we're doing is we're starting in Genesis this week, and we'll do one book a week. And we're giving you the summary of the entire book in about 15 minutes. So it's going to be fast, it's going to be furious, there's going to be a lot coming at you really quick. So if you have your phone, pull it out, take some notes. If you have a notepad, pull it out, and be active in the comments. If you guys hear a point that you like, drop it in the comments. If you hear a quote that's actually pretty good, tell me, because I'll be kind of surprised. I'm kidding. But really, drop it in the comments if you see it. We want you guys to be interacting with this. So today, we're talking about the Bible from 30,000 feet. And we're going to hit Genesis. So Genesis is the first book of the Bible. If you don't know that, turn to page 1. It's probably Genesis. And Genesis takes place in this region. This is called the Fertile Crescent. This is a super high quality picture I pulled off of Google Images. And specifically the Fertile Crescent is where we're going to be kind of at geographically today. So you guys get an idea of what's going on. But in Genesis, there's 4 major events we're going to look at. So that first event that we're going to talk about is formation, or you might know it as creation. This is Genesis chapters 1 and 2. What happens here, it says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved on the face of the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." Guys, this is the beginning. This tells how God created this whole universe, this whole world. I read a good quote, and it said, if you can't accept the first verses in the Bible, why would you believe the rest of it? So a lot of people really challenge and contest creation from a theistic worldview, from a view that says God made it all. Obviously, I'm sure you're familiar with evolution or just a bunch of other theories that are out there, but this is what happened, guys. This is reality. It is real, and God created it all, and it's important to know that. So that's Genesis chapters 1 and 2. In chapter 1, God creates everything. It's the narrative of that. In chapter 2, it goes back and tells the detail of how man was created, Adam and Eve. The second major event we have is the fall. It doesn't take long for God to create the world that man sinned and messed it up. So this is Genesis chapters 3 is really where it all begins. And the characters in this are Adam and Eve. Adam and his wife Eve were made by God. They were put in the garden. He told them, you can eat of any fruit of the garden, but you can't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, what happens? The serpent comes in, he deceives them, they take and they eat of the fruit, and then they fall, they fell, they sinned. Sin entered the world. Now, because of Adam's sin, all of us have sin in our own lives, and we all mess up, and I'm sure that you're familiar with that. If you've ever been disobedient to your parents, you've ever stolen, anything like that falls into that category. But that's what happened in Genesis chapter 3 through 5. It's really one of the saddest events that's ever happened in the history of mankind, because when this happened, we were all doomed to die because of what we had done. But the good news is God did something about that. Let's go ahead and look at the third thing we have, which is the flood, Genesis chapters 6 through 9. So the world got so wicked after the fall. Satan was doing such good work in creating very wicked people that it got to a point where people were so wicked, God said, this can't be anymore. We need to start over. And so he found one man and his family who were the only righteous in the whole world, and that was Noah. Noah and his 3 sons, their wives, and Noah's wife. And so Noah built an ark that looked like this. We got to go and visit the ark encounter in Kentucky, Lexington, I believe. It was an awesome experience. Go if you ever have the chance. But Noah built an ark. It never rained before, because there's a firmament above the earth. We can get into that later, but essentially what happened is God caused a worldwide flood that covered the entire world, that killed everyone except Noah and his family that were on the ark. It rained for 40 days, 40 nights, and then after about a year, the water subsided. Noah and his family left the ark, came back onto dry land, and began to multiply and spread out. The only issue is man again was disobedient again, so that leads to the fallout. So what's happened so far? We had formation. God created the world. We have the fall. Man messed it up. We had the flood. God tried to cleanse the world and saved Noah and his family through that to repopulate the earth. And then man again was sinful and wicked. So in the fallout, what happens is God commanded them to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the whole earth. That was the goal they had given. They did a good job at the first half. They were fruitful and they multiplied, but they stayed in one spot. They weren't spreading out. And in an act of rebellion to God, they built this thing called the Tower of Babel. Maybe you've heard of it before. And essentially they were saying that we can build our way up to the heavens and we can be our own gods, is what was kind of going on there. And so what God did there is he scattered the people by doing something pretty interesting. He made them all speak different languages. So back before then, everyone spoke one common language, but at the Tower of Babel, he divided them by giving them different languages. So now maybe one person was speaking Greek, another was speaking Latin, and another Hebrew. I don't know what all languages they were, but because of that, that caused them to spread out. But really from Genesis 10 through the rest of the Bible is just the stories of how God has been good to man, but man has continuously sinned against them. So that's the four major events that happen in the beginning of the book of Genesis. But we still have a good chunk. See, we're only in chapter 10. What about the other 30 or so chapters of Genesis? Good question. We have four patriarchs, the four great men of faith that God chose to use through the end of Genesis, that are really the main characters throughout this story. So this takes us between chapters 12 and chapters 50, really, of the book. This is kind of a line of what is going on here. So we have Abraham, who God chose first. He was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob, and Jacob was the father of Joseph. See, growing up in my head, I heard all these names, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and in my head they were just different characters. Didn't understand that it was kind of a family line going on here. But that is really important. It plays into what God does here. So let's look at our first character, Abraham. So Abraham lived in the land of Ur of the Chaldeans. If you remember our Fertile Crescent, he lived down towards the south of it. And God told him, I want you to go, I want you to take your family, and I want you to move to Canaan, which was a good long way away. This is a place that Abraham, or Abram at the time, had never seen. He didn't know anything about, but he trusted God in that. He took his family and he moved. Because of his great faith, God made a covenant with Abram at the time, or Abraham as we might know him. And it's found in Genesis chapter 12. I want to read you guys these verses together because they're very, very important through shaping the rest of the Old Testament. So let's read these. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. Now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And in you all of the families of the earth shall be blessed. Guys, that is what we know as the Abrahamic covenant. And essentially what God is promising him is to make him a great nation. Later we see that God says he would make his descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky or the sands on the seashore. And through Abraham's line, eventually redemption would come. All the world would be blessed, is what God tells him. The only issue is Abraham and his wife had never had a son. They were infertile. I think that's the correct term. Maybe I'm not a scientist. But they didn't have any children. So what did they do? They tried to fix things on their own accord. They brought in a servant girl, and she got pregnant. But that was not the way God had things. And it just caused way more problems than solutions, if we're being honest. And so fast forward, eventually God does what he always does. He comes through. He was faithful to Abraham, and he gave him a son. And his son was named Isaac. And that brings us to our second character of the four patriarchs in Genesis. So Isaac was the oldest son of Abraham, and he, well, technically oldest, you can put Jewish, different things. There's a lot there. We don't have time to get into it. But he was the son that was promised to Abraham from God. And his story really begins in a few different places, but in a major way with the finding of his wife Rebekah. God blesses him, gives him a wife, and they, like his father, had trouble having children again. And when they asked God what's going on, he said, you will have a son, but you will have twins, and they will be the fathers of nations. And God again came through on his promise. He had two sons. He had Esau and Jacob. Now Esau means hairy. He was covered in like red hair, really hairy dude. And Jacob meant heel grabber, because on the way out, Jacob grabbed Esau's heel and tried to like get out first. Yeah, there's also a lot there. We're not going to get into that. So what happens? Isaac has Jacob and Esau, and here we see kind of some issues start to arise. You see, Isaac favored Esau, and Esau was a hunter, he was an outdoorsman, and Isaac liked that, whereas Jacob was a little bit of a mama's boy. Nothing wrong with being a mama's boy, but it kind of caused division within the family. And so that really moves us on to our next character, Jacob. So Jacob's story begins whenever he steals his brother Esau's birthright. You see, the oldest Jewish son was supposed to get the blessing of the father, but Jacob was not the oldest. So one day Esau had been out hunting and working. He was very hungry. He came back, and Jacob saw this and saw an opportunity arise. So he said, Esau, I will trade you this bowl of soup, this bowl of stew, for your birthright, for your blessing that you're supposed to get from our father. And Esau was apparently really, really hungry, and apparently Jacob was a really good cook, because that's what Esau did. He traded him his birthright for a bowl of soup. It's a really interesting picture of trading the promises for just a temporary fulfillment that does not last at all. But that was the first big thing that Jacob does. The second big thing he does is, not only did he steal that from his brother, but when his father was getting old in age, he stole the birthright and the blessing from his father in a way. He deceived him. So what happened? Isaac was blind at this time. He couldn't see. And so he went in, he put on sheep's wool, so that his father would think he was Esau, because remember, Esau was hairy. Think about this, though. How hairy was Esau? If Jacob could throw on a lambskin, a sheepskin, and they would think that was him. I don't know. He must have been a really hairy dude. But he went in, he fixed his father's favorite meal, and his father Isaac gave him the blessing. Well, this created issue because Esau was furious about this. So in this time, Jacob fled away from Esau for fear of his life, and he ended up meeting his father-in-law, soon-to-be father-in-law, Laban. You see, Laban had daughters, many daughters. He had one in particular, though, Rachel, who was a little bit younger, who Jacob fell in love with. He promised to work for Laban for 7 years, and in order to get his daughter in payment, kind of. But the issue is that Laban tricked Jacob and gave him Leah, his oldest daughter, instead of Rachel. So instead of just taking one of them, eventually Jacob works 7 more years so that he can get Rachel as a wife as well. So now he has 2 wives, and there was some friction between them, obviously. Not really the way God designed it. God designed things to be one man, one woman for life, but he took 2, and that caused issues for him. You see, what happened is Leah and Rachel kind of got in this competition of who could bear the most children for him. And Leah had 10, Rachel had 2. And that really leads us on to our final patriarch in Genesis, which is Joseph. I'm sure you've heard of Joseph, coat of many colors, but he comes into the story in a different way, kind of. You see, he was the second youngest of Jacob, and he was Jacob's favorite because he was from his favorite wife, Rachel, and all of the other brothers were older and knew that he was the favorite, and they were jealous because of that. So he gets a special coat from his father, and he also has a dream. And in this dream, he sees all of his other brothers bowing down to him. And then he goes and he tells his other brothers. Well, that was the straw that broke the camel's back, and they decided they were going to kill him. So they took him out, they threw him in a pit, but then one of the older brothers said, actually, let's not kill him, let's just sell him into slavery. So that's what they do. They sell him into slavery to some Egyptians, and Joseph ends up making his way all the way to Egypt and working for Pharaoh and one of his men, specifically Potiphar. Well, God had his hand of blessing on Joseph, and Joseph was a great worker. So he worked his way up through the ranks in Potiphar's house. Well, eventually, Potiphar's wife took a liking to Joseph and tried to make sexual advances onto him. And he, being a good, upright, honest man, fled. Well, she wasn't happy about that, and she accused him of things he never did. That sent him to prison. So now Joseph is in prison in Egypt, away from his family, and he meets two more people, and they learn that he can interpret dreams because he interprets dreams for them, just like he had interpreted his dream way back in the day. And eventually, after he sat in prison for a very long time, and a few other things happened we can't get into, Pharaoh has a dream, and he doesn't know what it means. No one can tell him what it means, but somehow he finds that Joseph can interpret dreams. So he calls Joseph out of prison. Joseph comes to him, and he interprets his dream. And the interpretation is this, that Egypt would have 7 years of feast. They would have plentiful crops. Everything would be great for them. But after that, they'd have 7 years of famine. So because of this, he gets again appointed to where he's the second man in charge, second in command in all of Egypt. And during those 7 years of plenty, he stores up and hoards, stocks up, like people are doing with toilet paper, all the food and supplies that he can, so that in those 7 years of famine, they would have supplies, they would have food, and they'd be fine. Well, when they get to those 7 years of famine, Joseph's family from back home, who has no idea where he's gone. There's no cell phones, there's no internet back in this day. In their mind, Joseph will never be seen again. He's probably dead by now. He was sold as a slave. Well, they come to Egypt to get supplies because they're out of food. And that is where Joseph and his brothers get reunited. And he ends up blessing them with food and other things. And the highlight of the book is that Joseph says, you know what? What you meant for evil, God meant for good, and he's blessed us all through this. And that is how we close up the book of Genesis. Guys, that was a lot. That was fast and furious. I'm talking 200 miles an hour. But there's so much more we can get into. I encourage you to go back and read the book of Genesis. It's an interesting read. There's a whole lot there. But I wanted to give us just a few application points. I want to think about what can we learn from that whole book, 50 chapters, a lot of pages we just went over, a lot of stories of great men, a lot of stories of awesome things God has done. Well, here's 3 things. First is that God is our creator. God created everything in the beginning, and he is in charge. He is in control. So right now, you might be worried. You might be in a kind of frantic state because everything is changing around you. But I want to remind you that he's the creator. He's in control. This didn't surprise God. This didn't scare him. He knew it was going to happen. And we can rest in that. We can take refuge in that because our God is good and he is powerful. And he's bigger than any circumstance we're in. So that's the first thing I want us to remember. The second thing is that we are all sinners. You see, from the line of Adam, we all were born with a sin nature. You see, we're good at sinning. We do it on our own. You don't have to teach a toddler to scream and yell and throw a fit. And if you have any little siblings right now and you're all stuck in the house, I guarantee you know that very well. But we're all sinners. We all have fallen short of the statutes God has set. And because we've fallen short, we have separated ourselves from God. And because of that, we need redemption. We need a Savior. And the third point is that God has a purpose for our lives. You see, God loves us enough that he does not leave us where we are. And even though we have sinned and we've fallen away and we have rebelled against God, he sent his son Jesus Christ to the earth. And Jesus lived a perfect life, died on the cross, and paid the penalty for the sins that I committed, that you committed, that we all have committed. And that's good news. We can all accept that free gift of salvation to be reunited with God. But even past that, God has a purpose for our lives. Look at the life of Joseph. Look at the life of Abraham. God did great things through them, and they were just obedient. And guys, that is what God is calling us to even today. So maybe you're just at home, you're kind of stuck, you're hanging out. Be obedient to God. Be faithful in your spiritual disciplines. Be reading your Bible. Be praying. Be sharing the good news. Share these videos we're posting. Guys, you have such a great reach and influence among your friends, among your community, and a lot of them have probably never heard that there's a God in heaven that loves them and that they have sinned, but he loved them so much that he paid for it anyway. So I want to encourage you guys, share the content we're putting out. Take it in for yourselves. But I also want to encourage you to stick around for our virtual DNA groups that are coming up right after this. Connect with your group over Facebook Messenger, over maybe just the regular FaceTime, connect them over house party, whatever way you have to, figure out a way and get in touch, because even though we might be physically distancing, we are not social distancing right now. We have to stay social through this time. So guys, remember those three things. That God is our creator, that we are all sinners, but God has a purpose for our lives. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you can drink from a water hose, because that was coming at you real quick. You guys have a great week. We'll see you again later. Holy cow, that's so much content.